Today's lessons, we hear a good bit about the Sabbath and what that means. As I was thinking about this, I was struck by how unique this must have been in antiquity. To be sure, there were holidays and festivals in most ancient cultures. We hear about the festival when the Nile flooded to provide water and rich soil to the farmers in Egypt. Indeed, the reputation of the clergy in Egypt depended on their ability to predict those floods. And we hear about the festivals and holidays in Greece and Rome and Babylon and Assyria to mark the days to celebrate this or that deity with a major production down at the shrine or the temple. But those were not like the Sabbath. First, of course, they only came around every so often. But more importantly, they often involved more effort and work than a normal day. And at least it seems to be the case, many of them didn't provide much of a break for those on the lower rungs of the ladder. The farm worker out in the field or the household servant doesn't seem to have regularly benefited from the idea that this should be a day off. The notion of having a regular, predictable, and frequent day of rest and worship seems to be pretty much only to have been a part of the experience of Israel. I expect we all recognize that the notion of the Sabbath is embodied in the fourth commandment. You recall the words, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." Actually, this particular commandment is explained twice in the Hebrew Scriptures, in both Exodus and in Deuteronomy. In Exodus, we're told that God rested from creation on the seventh day, and therefore that day is to be observed. In Deuteronomy, we're told that Israel had been slaves in Egypt, and therefore this day of rest was to be observed to remember that bondage. It's clearly about our relationship with God, and yet it's also socially radical, especially in Deuteronomy. The reason the people are charged to observe the Sabbath is so that their slaves will get to rest too. Rest is not the privilege of the powerful, but the right of everyone. Whatever the rationale, it's clear that ancient Israel did something that almost no one else even thought of, let alone observed. The language we hear from Isaiah today reminds us of the importance of this idea. Isaiah seems to make two dramatic demands of the ancient Israelites, and by extension of us. First, if the people want to find favor in the eyes of God, they must engage in massive social reform. To serve God authentically is, now this is a quote, to unlock the fetters of wickedness and to untie the cords of the yoke. It is to share your bread with the hungry and take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, to clothe him and not to ignore your own kin. Second, the prophet instructs the people to commit more deeply and more genuinely to observance of the Sabbath. If you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your affairs in my holy day, if you call the Sabbath delight and the Lord's day honored, then you can seek the favor of the Lord. The problem for Isaiah's audience was that people were pursuing their own interests, not God's, honoring their own purposes, not God's. It's no accident that the prophet connects their faulty observance of Sabbath with issues of justice, such as feeding the hungry and meeting the needs of the afflicted. If we ignore God's purposes for Sabbath, just as if we ignore hungry people, all will not be right in our world. And so we come to today's episode from the Gospels. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus manages to get himself into considerable trouble by healing on the Sabbath. Jesus draws the line in the proverbial sand, confronting the synagogue's leaders' rebuke of him by laying claim to a higher commandment, that of the two great commandments, to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. By noting that the care taken to unbind livestock is a part of practice so that they may continue to live, he pointed to the care that God has taken for this woman by unbinding her so that she might live fully. It's clear how easily many in Jesus' time might become overzealous in their observance of the Sabbath. In her book, Mudhouse Sabbath, Lauren Winner observes, over time the rabbis teased out of the text just what the prohibition on work meant, first identifying 39 categories of activities to be avoided on the Sabbath, and then fleshing out the implication of each of those 39. For example, if one is not to light a fire, one also ought not handle matches or kindling. So this prohibition was not some casual expectation. The sacred nature of the Sabbath was expected to be preserved at all costs. That really is the point of the leader of the synagogue, to maintain the established order of things. He represents the status quo that Jesus' healing would disrupt. For him, doing good is not the point, because Jesus' good deeds undermine the social order. The desire to control the Sabbath observances has been seen in other people seeking to impose other social orders. In the American South, before the Civil War, the system of slavery was in part maintained by the restrictions on doing good on the Sabbath. Frederick Douglass wrote, "It was necessary to keep our religious masters at St. Michael's unacquainted with the fact that, instead of spending the Sabbath in wrestling, boxing, and drinking whiskey, we were trying to learn how to read the will of God, for they had much rather see us engaged in those degrading sports than to see us behaving like intellectual, moral, and accountable beings." So what does God intend for the Sabbath? What does freedom from work and freedom from the concerns of the work, which is implied in the idea of a Sabbath, make us free to do? Well, we're free for rest. We need it. We all need it. Adults and children, executives, bus drivers, students, teachers, nurses, homemakers, all of us. We're mortal after all, and resting reminds us that we are creatures with real bodily needs to stop, to replenish, and to rest. Part of this rest is the permission and indeed the obligation to put down our obsession with doing things. How many of us will leave here today and check our smartphone or similar device just to see what's happening at our work? I know I've been guilty of that in the past, going so far as to take my little device on retreats because, of course, I saw myself as the indispensable person who just could not be away for even a little bit of the 24/7, 365 culture of work. This rest is also a justice issue because we need an economy in which people can make a living wage so that no one needs to work every day of the week in order to make ends meet and provide for the needs of their household. We're free to remember our dependency on God. Sabbath reminds us that God is God and we can stop trying to be God. Again, am I really the indispensable person who cannot be out of touch for even a day? We can rest, worshiping the true God, the one God, and learning about the real God. We're free to worship, to immerse ourselves in God's eternity, in a place and time set aside, in an activity in which we produce nothing but praise, where we're valued not because of what we make, not because of what we do, not because of what we achieve, but because we are created by God and loved by God. Jesus' healing of the crippled woman and his admonition of the synagogue leader shows that those things done in the service of others for God's glory and purpose are different in character from the mundane types of things we think of as work. These things are to be done whenever and wherever needed, even on the Sabbath, because they need to be done. Jesus seems to be saying with each incident of this Sabbath work that when we have the opportunity, regardless of when or where it is, we must do the work we've been given to do, to heal, to welcome, to love, to encourage, and to serve. The collect for this Sunday prays that we might be able to show God's power to all people. It also reminds us that we can only be gathered together in unity by the power of the Holy Spirit. Look around and see the people that God has sent to be present with us today. Really, look around and see the people that God has sent to be present with us. But also notice those who, for whatever reason, are not with us today. Use the power granted by God's grace and make sure that those folks are made to feel the healing love that God has for them, and join with the crowd that witnessed Jesus' Sabbath work of healing and rejoice at all the wonderful things that Jesus is doing still in our lives.